Welcome to Peter and Phil's Courageous Conversations, a podcast addressing race relations and social issues in hopes that you'll be inspired to do the same. Now, let's begin our conversation with your hosts, Dr. Peter Weinstein and Dr. Philip Nelson.
Welcome to Courageous Conversations. I'm Dr. Peter Weinstein. I'm here with my partner in crime and punishment, Dr. Philip Nelson, and we've got a special guest who we'll be introducing shortly. Appreciate everybody listening in, all 13 of you. And we also want to thank our sponsor, Nationwide, for their belief in our messaging, and our producer, Nicole, for doing everything she can to make us look 30, 40 years younger and sound younger as well. Dr. Nelson, what's cooking?
Not much, except that Nicole's failed on the look part for me in terms of looking younger, but she does a good job on my voice, so that's all I can count on. How things going with you? Have any of the recent events of the nation thrown you out of kilter again?
Well, I was in Florida last week, but I got out before Milton decided to visit Florida, and have had some friends who were impacted and had to move. Just been super busy. I was teaching this week at the veterinary college at Western, and so my focus was on the next generation of veterinary students and helping give them some knowledge in business and finance. Had some great guest speakers for them. So one of the nice things about teaching is, at least for that 4-hour period, I was disconnected from the bombardment of news and really just focused on helping the students gather some knowledge. So it's good to be back on campus.
So you were having fun then?
Oh, yeah, I was.
That's good.
It's always fun when you're with young people. They make you feel young.
Yeah, I know. Tell me about it.
We got a young person on as a guest today, too, don't we?
Yeah, we do. We're fortunate and looking forward to speaking to Stacy Pursell, and we're going to let her introduce herself and give our audience a brief bio of her history. And Stacy, welcome to Courageous Conversations.
Well, thank you so much, Phil and Peter, for having me here. And first of all, thank you for calling me a young person. I appreciate that. Because when I'm around young people, I don't feel young. It makes me feel old. But thank you again for the invitation. Phil, I had you on my podcast, and then we talked about me being on your podcast, and I'm very happy to be here talking with both of you today.
Well, we're happy to have you here too. And for the sake of the audience, why don't we just go ahead and get into it and start with, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself? First, start with what you're doing now, and then we'll guide you through your history.
Okay, sure. That sounds good. So, what I am doing right now, I'm the founder of the Vet Recruiter. I do executive search and recruiting across the animal health industry and the veterinary profession. So, what that means is I'm hired by companies, whether that be for-profit or nonprofit organizations, animal health companies, veterinary practices, universities, nonprofits. And I help them find the talent that they need at all levels, and I don't know how deep you want me to go into this, but from all levels, from board of directors to executives to mid-level management. I find companies, salespeople, people in marketing, research and development, and I find veterinarians for veterinary practices.
Your company's been around for 20 years now, hasn't it?
Starting 28 years this past August. So I started my 28th year, August of this year.
Wow. So you did start as a baby.
Well, technically, the Vet Recruiter has been around for 20 years, but I started the business inside a large international search firm. They were not in the veterinary space, and I got them into the veterinary space. And then I bought that division out 20 years ago. So technically, I was with them for almost 8 years and then independent for over 20 years.
Now, to the best of my knowledge, nobody goes to college to become a recruiter or an executive search person. So what was your education background, and what was your epiphany that changed your direction into executive search? Unless you're one of the unicorns that went to school specifically thinking you would be a matchmaker.
No, when I went to school, I never heard of executive search. I didn't even know what a recruiter did. So I was at Oklahoma State University, and my major was broadcast journalism because my goal was to anchor the nightly news. And that started when I was a kid. When I was a child, I created a newspaper for my family because I loved writing. And I would write about events that were happening in my family, and I would just hand the newspaper that I would write with notebook paper and a pen and hand it to my family members. And so I went to Oklahoma State, and one of the reasons I decided to major in broadcast journalism was because I was an introverted, shy kid. And I thought, what would you have to do something to get yourself out of that? So I thought, I don't want to be shy. I don't want to be introverted. I want to do something that's going to stretch me and make me feel, less introverted. And I love journalism and I loved writing. So I decided to go to Oklahoma State and get a degree in broadcast journalism. So when I was there, I wrote for the student newspaper, and the editor sent me out to interview the dean, who was heading up a search committee to find Oklahoma State a new president of the school. So I interviewed the dean and I found out about the process that a university would take to hire a new president for the school. And so I did that interview. I wrote the article, it was on the front page of the paper. I graduated. I ended up working for an advertising agency. And then I worked for a Fortune 500 company. I got married. My husband was getting calls from recruiters. He worked in accounting, he was a CPA, and he would get calls from recruiters often. And then his sister worked in executive search and recruiting back in the early 90s when they were talking about Y2K. She was placing a lot of people in the IT industry. And it's kind of funny because how I got my job is I answered a newspaper ad. And I know today that's not how people find their jobs. They don't find them in the help wanted ads. But there was an ad in the newspaper where an executive search firm was hiring an executive recruiter. And I was in my 20s, but I thought this sounds fascinating. So I applied and they hired me. And I was the youngest person in the office. And most of the people in the firm, they had had long careers in whatever industry they were recruiting in. So we had an engineer that worked in our firm, and he had spent like 30 or 40 years as an engineer. And he was at the end of his career and he was placing engineers. And we had a lady who was a nurse, and she had worked as a nurse for decades, and then she was placing nurses. So most of the people were placing people in the field they had worked in for a long time. Well, I got hired to place executives with Fortune 500 companies, specifically in the sales and marketing space, and more specifically in the food and beverage industry. So I was working with human food companies, very large companies, and I was helping them find sales and marketing executives. A pet food company that was a division of a human food company asked me to find an executive to run their pet food division. And so I filled that position and I started connecting with other executives that were running sales and marketing in the pet food space. One of those executives who was working for another pet food company, he said, "We need to hire an executive for a very high level role, but we need them to be a veterinarian." And so I went back to my manager at the time and he said, "Stacy, if you can figure out how to spell the word veterinarian, the search process is the same. You go about it the same way. You can find a veterinarian the same way you can find a head of sales." So I found a veterinarian for that company. And then I got connected with the head of HR for uh, PetSmart. And they were putting the vet clinics, which are today Banfield, and they had not worked with the recruiter before, the veterinary side, because it was just getting started. They hadn't worked with the recruiter before. So we got hired. I built a team. We helped them find about 300 people, 300 veterinarians. And I found that I really like talking to veterinarians. I said veterinarians are more interesting and nicer to talk with than sales executives in the food and beverage space. And so I approached the company that I was working for at the time. I said, "I would love to work with veterinarians." They said, "Stacy, we hired you to place sales and marketing executives in the food and beverage space. We've never been in the vet space. That space is so small, they would never need a recruiter to work in that space." And they handed me a book of specialties or niches. This book was like this thick, and it had every specialty from accounting to finance to law. and veterinary medicine wasn't in there. And I said, veterinary medicine is not in there. Therefore, we need to be in the vet space. And they said, no, it's not in there. We've never been in the vet space. We don't need to be in the vet space. So they said, you can dabble in the vet space, but we want you to continue to place executives with Fortune 500 companies. So I did both. And I was there for close to 8 years. By the time I left, I was only working in the vet space, and I was so busy, I didn't have time to work in any other niches. But I ultimately left and bought out the business and started the Vet Recruiter because that's the space I wanted to be in. And they weren't completely sold on that.
And how have you liked it since?
I've never looked back. There's nothing I have ever wanted to do since.
Okay.
It's
Wow.
there's an irony in all of this because as somebody who was a devout introvert, based upon your original comments, to work with a profession that's composed of a plethora of introverts, it's probably each of you trying to pull out the conversation when you're talking to veterinarians. So I found that interesting as well. What was the name of the student newspaper at Oklahoma State? Because it's got to have something to do with cowboys.
The Daily O'Collie.
Okay.
Well, there's another irony too, and that is, you notice she said that her original desire was to be a newscaster,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and yet you don't listen to the news. So
There is an irony to that. And the reason I stopped listening to the news on a nightly basis, because I used to listen to the news every night. That was the last thing I would do before I go to bed at night. But the news is so negative, and I would go to bed sad and depressed and wanting to fix all these problems that seem like just a never-ending supply of problems. And I thought, what if I turn off the news? I think I'll go to bed happier and get a better night's sleep. So it's been probably 10 years since I still know what's happening in the world. I still, stay on top of current events, but I don't watch the nightly news, and I haven't for about 10 years. In fact, I don't watch television at all. The television is rarely on in my house.
that's a pretty quiet house then for you.
It's not quiet, but we don't have the buzz of the TV.
So tell us about your family.
Well, so my husband and I have been married for 28 years, and we have 5 children.
Well, in preparation for this podcast, it was I just wanted to note and want the people to understand that Stacy's number one passion is her family, and I thought we at least ought to give them a little time to be noted here. But I want to go back right now though to the fact that you don't watch the news. And one of the questions that I was asking you is what were you most concerned about in terms of the national um, temperature, if you will, in any area. And you want to tell our audience your response.
Yeah, so my biggest concern and the reason I stopped watching the news, in addition to it being so negative, is just a lack of civility with the people, just in general, just a lack of decorum, just, the negativity. It's kind of like I watched 10 minutes of the presidential debate. I had to turn it off because there is a lack of decorum with people that have different opinions about different issues. And what people do is they'll do a personal attack on the individual person instead of debating the issues in a civilized way.
Part of a common thread of what Phil and I have been talking about for years, which is this increasing polarization and the inability to have a conversation where you can just agree to disagree and shake hands and walk away and still be friends. It's becoming harder and harder to have civil conversations, and politics is a common thread. It was interesting listening to where your kids went to go to school, that nobody went to Oklahoma State, and it's like knowing Oklahoma State, A&M, all of those schools are so competitive from a sports standpoint. But you know what's interesting about sports? You can walk away and still be friends even after you beat each other up on the field. And why can't we do that as people? I mean, that's part of this environment that we're currently in. And I concur as to your assessment of this lack and loss of civility. And a lot of this is just the polarized country we live in.
It's so polarized. And, I was a kid growing up in the 80s, and it seemed like, and maybe I was naive because I was younger, but I don't remember it like this then, where it was so polarized like it is now.
Well, I was a kid growing up in the 60s, and I noticed that Peter is smiling because I've just given away the gap in our ages. I have to tell you that, but then again, I was growing up in the South. I grew up in the South. I grew up in Mississippi, and I do remember it being just as polarized for a lot of different reasons. However, we honored the tradition of civility, even in that polarization. I don't think the polarization is the issue. I think it is our lack of adherence to the rules of civility that is the problem. I think that there has been an introduction that it's okay to win at all costs, even if it that as a matter of fact, it's probably better if we depress the expression of alternative thought. And if that means throwing away the rules, throwing out the rules in order to get a certain train of thought heard or become the predominant thought, so be it, with with no regard to future consequences of that of that action. And I think, and so I found your concern. One, first of all, it resonated with both of us when we saw it, and our listeners, our 13 devout listeners, will realize that this is more of same when it comes to the message that we're trying to give. But being dismayed is not enough. I'd like to know what you think we ought to do about it. How can we change this? Because it's clear that even during if one were to be able to get back to 1775 when when the first constitutional convention was being held and they were trying to come up with the US Constitution, a marvel of a document, one might accuse them of being incivil too in their discussions, in their debates, and yet they persevered because there was a common uh, uh, principle. They needed something better than a king. They needed something better than the dominance of England over their lives. And no matter how angry they got with each other, no matter how much, there were even days when they wouldn't talk to each other during that, they still overcame it. What will it take for us to do that again?
I think it comes down to respect, people just recognizing that in a country with 300, how many people? 300 something million people in this country,
Yeah.
that there's going to be 300 million and something different opinions about a lot of different things, and just recognizing that we're not all the same, that we all have different life experiences that shape us, and people change over time, with their viewpoints and things. But take any issue like dress code at work. Should we wear this or should we wear that? Different people are going to have different opinions. And then somebody's going to decide, what that dress code is. But when you're debating an issue, recognize that not everybody has the same viewpoint. Don't personally attack that person as an individual because of their viewpoint. Acknowledge it, be able to remain professional, civil, it's like over the last 4 years during COVID. I heard so many instances of people saying that because they had a certain viewpoint about some issue related, they lost lifelong friends, which was really sad to hear some of these stories that you lose a lifelong friend over a disagreement about a certain issue. Why can't they just disagree and continue to be friends? But I think it all comes down to respect and acknowledging that people have different viewpoints and respecting the fact that they do, and being civil about it.
One of the things that Phil and I have commonly discussed is kind of a lack of discussion of civics and government and understanding as to how we got from where we were to where we are. And I think we have had a huge change in our value structures as well. And respect is commonly a core value that many people have. But I'm not sure that we sit down at the dinner table with our kids any longer and talk about values. I would have been interested. Your kids were kind of right in their teenage when you decided to turn off the TV and maybe decrease some of their exposure, at least in your household, to events that were going on outside. So I'm intrigued to know whether they came home at night after going to high school, middle school, elementary school, with conversations that they heard from their classmates that they weren't necessarily hearing from the news. Maybe they were hearing it from you and Daryl, but how was that with your kids dealing with kind of a little bit of a, I don't want to call it a censorship, but at least a controlling of the information that they got?
Well, actually, so Daryl and I would watch the nightly news, but our kids didn't watch the nightly news. So our kids actually grew up without television most of their lives. So when they were little, they would watch some of the shows like Dora the Explorer and some of those cartoons when they were little. As they grew older, they really did not watch TV, and the reason why is because they were in sports, they were in activities, they were with their friends, they were playing outside, they were playing with each other. So we just kept them so busy. And then my viewpoint was that if they're in front of the TV, that's unproductive for them, and I'd rather them be outside getting exercise. We encourage them to read. They read a lot. All of our kids have loved to read, and they would read a lot of books. And so, just from an early age, we just made it intentionally. We did not turn on the TV, so it wasn't like they came home as teenagers and we just stopped watching TV. They just pretty much grew up without it. And when the TV was on in our house, it was really just at night, Daryl and I sitting in our room watching the nightly news. And then sometimes on the weekends, there would be a sports game on. But other than that, the TV was just rarely on in our house.
My kids didn't grow up watching much TV either, probably because they were both in sports. And by the time they got done with their training, they had homework to do. But we did talk about some of the issues that were going on. Even without TV, did you and Daryl start talk about some of the issues in the world that were going on over the dinner table?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about some of the issues. I mean, mostly it was really, what the kids were doing in school and their sports and what was happening in their own lives, like big things. They would know when it was an election or some big current event. We would talk about those things.
So, I was thinking about, so you mentioned one aspect that you think that, and that is fostering mutual respect. And I get that. But I want to push back a little and say that that's not all of it, or it can't be, because in the 60s, when I was growing up in Mississippi, I wasn't necessarily respected. At least my culture was. Being 6 or 7 to 12 years old, of course I'm not going to be respected. I'm a forming human being. But I remember when we were talking about the news that I heard in Jackson, Mississippi was littered with diminishing language for African Americans in Mississippi. The N word was literally used in newscasts. If a black man robbed a store, he wasn't called colored or black. The N word was used. And that's a public sign of disrespect for a certain demographic of people. And yet the chivalry and rules of civility were still followed in every other way. And we started out with, why can't we have civil discourse? This is my connection here. And so what I'm saying is it's possible to accommodate disrespect and still be civil. The South has proven that very well in the aristocratic culture that it eventually developed while maintaining slavery. So what else can we do to reestablish what else contributes to the basis of civility, in your opinion? And I hope you don't think I'm trying to be confrontational or pushing back. I'm just using my own experiences here to broaden the discussion a little?
Well, something that I hear quite often is a phrase called, you know, emotional intelligence. And you had Rob Best on your program. I had him on my program. He talks a lot about emotional intelligence, people doing things that I see this all the time in interview situations. I had one happen this week where a candidate got ruled out of an interview situation because that candidate thought the interview went well. He thought, I'm going to get this job. I did great in the interview. And the hiring manager said the candidate lacked emotional intelligence, that he talked too much, that he wore her out, that he was exhausting to talk to. And I think that there are a lot of people that just lack emotional intelligence and self-regulation and just being aware of how they're impacting other people with their words, their actions. My youngest son, he'd be outside and he'd get excited and he'd jump up and down, he'd land on my foot. And he would do it over and over again. And I would say, know what's happening with your body. You have to self-regulate. So I think that just being able to regulate yourself, emotions, emotional intelligence. But I mean, I think it comes down to decency, treating other people. I was taught, love your neighbor. Your neighbor's anybody that you come in contact with. It's not just your next door neighbor, but just treat people better than you want to be treated.
So I want
So
to.
go
Sorry,
ahead,
Phil.
Peter. No, go
No,
ahead, Peter.
I was going to digress for a minute because I want to wrap up this section by asking a question that we really didn't address earlier on when you were talking about your children. You talked about your two-legged children, but we didn't learn anything about your four-legged children. Now, for somebody who's working in the veterinary industry, I would really hope that you have some four-legged civil children.
Well, so I've had cats all my life. Our kids had a dog who passed away a couple years ago of colon cancer, but our dog was a border collie mix, and she was very loving and very hyper. Her name was Georgie, and we had her most of my kids' life. She passed away a couple years ago, and with the kids going off to college and all the travel that we're doing, we don't have a four-legged animal. We do have a frog that we've had for 8 years. We got this frog at the pet store. It lives in a water tank, and they said the frog will last 2 years, and we've had the frog for 8. So right now, the frog is our only pet.
So emotional intelligence, I can't tell you how relevant I think that is. I mean, that is probably one of the most important aspects of life that we are not keyed into. And I really think it's an important aspect of our lives individually, but I think it's also very relevant in the field of veterinary medicine as well. And so I think your point on addressing emotional intelligence as another way of understanding the issues that are out there is very salient in our conversation.
So you all do realize what you're also implying, right? That somehow the nation has a problem with emotional intelligence. I mean, the discussion is about our national conversation. And I'm not disagreeing that emotional intelligence is important. I'm not. But if this is one of the key aspects of civility, then what do we do about that? How do we address that? And that's more a rhetorical question because we don't have any psychologists on the panel right now. And so, and I'm asking out of personal ignorance here. And if you want to go back to that, that's fine. But I want to put something else out there again. And this is not in a contention with what's been said so far. But what is this? We seem to have become attractive to othering again, public othering. Do you know what I mean? When we start, it is the practice of promoting the differences of others as a demeaning characteristic. When during the debate, and I don't know if you stayed in long enough, Stacy, to hear the former president say that in Ohio, Haitians were eating cats and dogs and threatening the pets of the community for their
I
diet.
didn't hear that part live during the debate, but I heard the commentary afterwards about it.
Okay.
The people were
That's a
talking about.
practice of othering. For that to have any basis of any tethering basis, one must assume that Haitians eat cats and dogs as part of their normal diet. One must assume that they have different values when it comes to pets. One must assume certain things that allow us then to diminish them as another class of human beings, which then leads us to other conclusions. That is usually the psychological basis of discrimination of any demographic of society. And so I submit that it has become more and more common to accept the premises of othering by saying that, by subtly accepting that there is the human race, and then within the human race, there is a stratification of human beings. And this is different than saying there are super athletes and clumsy people. This is based on our assessment of intellect, skin color, things that we have no proof about that causes those differences.
And what would be nice is if we could go back to finding commonalities, finding the things that make us human. I mean, we're all human. We all have the same basic needs. We all desire to be loved. We have the same need for food, shelter. I mean, and there's things that unite us too. And if we could go back and find some of those things that are the common things, that we have in common, that would be nice instead of focusing so much on the differences.
I totally agree. And this gets back to my analogy with the Constitutional Convention, that the one thing that they agreed on was they couldn't leave without a document that they could fight for that said they needed to get rid of the king. And even though they had individual arguments, and one of them was slavery, and they compromised on that because their primary goal was the king at the time. And so right now, we don't seem to have a common goal about our country, whether it's still great or do we want to make it great again, and if we could find common goals, understanding that we are a much more educated society now and that there are certain compromises that won't stand the way they did in 1775.
Because back at that time, when there was the king, it was the king's lineage. It was whoever was born into that family was the next king. And so our country was based on the premises of you reelect your president every 4 years.
Yes,
So if you don't like what's happening, then in 4 years you can vote them out and vote somebody else in.
which was a revolution at the time. The entire European system, ruling European system, was an autocratic system. It wasn't just England. It was also France. All of our allies had kings or royalty, even the ones, and they were fighting each other. So when we aligned with France to help us be free of England, we elicited an autocracy to do that.
Now I want to push back on something, Phil,
Go ahead.
which shouldn't surprise you. You say we're better educated. I would say we have more knowledge and information, but I'm not sure we're better educated in common sense, commonalities, and emotional intelligence. I think we have a lot more access to news, a lot more access to fact or fiction, but I'm not so sure we have used the resources that we have developed in our brains to look for solutions to the problems, even though so I would push back in terms of better educated. Yes, we have a lot more information, but it's how you use that information and knowledge that leads to the ultimate outcome. So that's where my pushback comes in.
Well,
I would say we have more information than we've ever had coming at us from all different angles.
I agree. I'm not so sure that's a pushback. I think that's I think it's a miss. I know what you're trying to say. I don't. I'm not going to push back because I don't think it applies in that we are better educated. I didn't say we were completely educated. We are better educated in certain areas. We have we do have severe deficits, for instance, in healthcare. We have a lot to learn about mental health, and yet we're better educated and better applicated in areas like cardiology and dermatology. So I can accept that we have a long way to go when it comes to social skills. We have a long way to go when it comes to societal development. We have a long way to go when it comes to mental health. We have areas that we're still working on.
I would say something here too that I think the smartphone has made us a little dumb. I heard this that Steve Jobs didn't let his kids have smartphones. I don't know if that's true, but I've heard that. And now everybody is connected to their smartphone all the time and social media. If you ever look at a news article and read the comments, like don't do it. Don't ever read the comments at the bottom of a news article because people can hide behind
Yes.
people. We used to have more face-to-face communication or on the phone. Now it's the texting, it's the comments at the bottom of the article, and people can write anything at the bottom of the article because they can hide. They don't even have to put their name. But now it's like people sometimes they hide behind the texting instead of having a face-to-face or pick up the phone and have a conversation. I noticed. So the other day, I asked my son to do a couple of chores around the house, and he didn't do them right away. And so I had this thought. I've never done this before, but I went over to my phone and I texted him and said, "Can you do these 2 chores?" He immediately got up after he saw the text and went and did the chores. And I said to my husband, I said, I just realized that my son did not respond to my verbal ask, but he responded to the text immediately. My kids have grown up with smartphones, and I would say that, I mean, my kids are smart. I'm not saying my kids are not smart, but I think that smartphones just make us dumb.
Well, I wouldn't say it makes us, actually, I agree that it can make us act dumbly, but I love your analogy about the smartphone and your kid, and would like to suggest that it might be because there's a tone that we have with our children that they don't necessarily, that they resent a little. And one of their acts of independence is to delay. But when you sent that same message, which I didn't have smartphones when my kids were young, I wish I'd had that now that I think about this. When you sent that text message to remind him of the request, he read it without the tone. He read it without that voice, and it was simply from mom now. And and again, this is that emotional intelligence that we learn as we develop, right? And so it was easier for him to, it wasn't an opportunity to test his independence the way children do all the time with their parents. And I think that, and I don't think it's because he's trained to respond to text messages. This was just a recognition that this was his duty and he's supposed to do it. And why is he fighting it? As opposed to fighting mom, which kind of goes back to what Peter was saying in terms of why we may not be as intelligent as we think. We invent tools before we invent the rules on how to use them. Even now, Congress is trying to decide whether smartphones should be in schools or not at all. And we invented the atom bomb before we realized the danger of it. Even now, AI is our big dilemma. We're all afraid of how some of us are afraid that AI will suddenly outsmart us. Others are afraid that AI will complicate our normal processes so much that we won't be able to tell the difference between reality and digitally derived images, etc.
We ran into something like that in our recruiting firm. We were using a job board to post jobs, and we did not know that they had added this AI component. And so the AI component was rewriting the job
Yes,
post after we had put them on the platform, and it was changing the job title, and then it was posting them on all these different platforms with different job titles and different
that you didn't ask
descriptions.
him to.
It didn't ask it, it just ran amok, and we were going, what is going on here? And then we finally saw they did that and turned it off, but it just got out of control very fast.
Yeah, and the opposite is happening in medicine and education too. We have a in the tenure process, it is our practice to send a professor's record to other institutions to have other professors review it. And one institution found out that some of the professors that they sent their records to used AI to help put their report together, their response together. And their immediate response was to pass a policy that said they won't accept any reports from any referrals that used AI. Now, the problem with that is they could have used AI simply to improve the writing of their opinion. The other is they could have just taken the record, put it through AI, and AI wrote the whole thing. How do you know? And is that reaction an overreaction, or is it real protection? That's what we have to deal with now.
So we started this segment not that long ago talking about emotional intelligence.
Yes.
Now we're talking about artificial
Digital
intelligence. And somewhere in between, we recognize that we're not as smart as we think we are, even though we have more knowledge and information being tube fed into us at this point in time. So I want to bring it back to the emotional intelligence things as we wrap up this segment, because I do think that, Stacey, you were talking about articles and comments and email and texts. Well, none of those have emotions. And I think the interesting thing is where we are losing emotions. And artificial intelligence doesn't have emotions. So your point about emotional intelligence, EI or EQ, is extremely important in an environment where we're starting to lose emotions because people are in front of digital resources, tablets, computers, laptops, phones, which don't have emotions. And I think part of the issues that we're dealing with are this delaying of emotional intelligence. I mean, many kids are very stunted in their emotions as a result of this. And I think a lot of the incivility can come directly from that. Let's
Clearly, we're not going to be able to finish this conversation because we've gone all over the place, but I have enjoyed the breadth of the conversation. And I think that Peter, you and Stacey have done an excellent job pointing out the complexity of communication from a intellectual standpoint to an emotional standpoint to a development perspective. And I just want to thank both of you for engaging in this part of the conversation.
But I want to continue the conversation on emotional intelligence.
So now we'll come back next week and we're going to continue this conversation.
All right.
Thank you for joining us for another courageous conversation. Be sure to follow us and check back next week for more.